This is a Danger Entertainment podcast. DangerEntertainment.net. Danger Entertainment Podcast Network.
Please note that any comments, jokes, questions, maybe anything that we say on the History of Bad Ideas is all in good fun. And remember, we insult everybody. Our thoughts, opinions, questions, anything else, actions that we do on the show do not reflect any of our employers, organizations, advertisers, or anyone else that is associated with the History of Bad Ideas. And remember, at the end of the day, it's just a joke.
It's about comic books and movies, growing up with Rokusuki. Superman before Zack Snyder ruined him. Michael Keaton was the best Batman, while Christian Bale was just deadpan. No one remembers the other ones. Princess Leia in bikinis and Transformer Lamborghinis. Please don't let Shia LaBeouf ever act again.
Please, God, no.
Remembering Tales from the Crypt, back when Michael Bay wrote good scripts.
He wrote the
All
scripts.
right here is no mystery, 'cause it's the history of bad.
It's bad.
It's the history of bad.
So bad.
It's the history of bad ideas. It's the history of bad.
It's bad.
It's the history of bad.
So bad.
It's the history of bad ideas.
Podcast.
Hello, History of Bad Ideas listeners, and welcome to this special fireside holiday interview chat with writer and producer Ben Riggs, who's my new best friend, but doesn't know it yet. Thanks for listening. This is about a 1-hour interview. It was my first one going solo all by myself, and Ben was a very good sport as he put up with my technical difficulties and my rambling questions, tangents, and interruptions. But overall, if you like TSR, Dungeons & Dragons, role-playing games, and walking trees like Jason, maybe you should give this one a good listen to. It's a little less than an hour. Hope you enjoy it. Happy holidays. Happy New Year. And hello, Hobie fans. This is Blake, and today we have a special guest interview with Ben Riggs. According to his business card, he is a writer, producer. He is the host of the podcast Plot Points. He is an author who has written a book called Encounter Theory, the Adventure Design Workbook. He's had several articles published. You can find his articles on places such as Geek and Sundry, and essentially, basically, an RPG everyman. Hello, Ben. How are you doing?
Hey, Blake. Thanks for having me on.
It's my pleasure. Honestly, I'm very excited and maybe a little nervous, as a lot of people will listen saying, "Hey, that's not how Blake normally sounds." But I'm very excited. This goes back all the way to Gen Con in August of this year, when I usually get to go to Gen Con and I get to see and play, all kinds of games. I've been going there for several years, ever since I became a functioning adult living back in the United States, and I can actually afford to go to places like that. And I usually try to get a number of seminars, because I'm always looking for something better, something educational, something that I can come across. And so I sat through my first seminar, and it was essentially mostly for beginning dungeon masters, people running games. And the seminar immediately afterwards was this gentleman by the name of Ben Riggs. And I think your first seminar was the actual, and was it the Encounter Theory?
Yep, that was the Encounter Theory seminar.
It was the Encounter Theory seminar. And I listened to that, and I was like, I like this guy. And you said, oh, by the way, I've got these other seminars coming up. And I was like, all right, what are these? And basically, those were 3rd edition D&D, Creation of a Masterpiece. And I said, I like this guy even better. And then your next one is Why TSR Failed. I said, I don't know what to do. And then the TSR West, the Hope and Tragedy. I was like, well, son of a gun, I really need to go see these. So if it's any consolation to you, make you feel better, I actually ditched a game so I can go see those other seminars.
That is a high compliment. Gen Con is prime time for gaming. So if you're going to ditch a game, that says something.
Yes, and I'm also very, pretty picky. But fortunately, the games I did ditch
were the backup ones because I didn't get in the ones that I really wanted to.
Oh, okay, that's better.
So I don't know how you're gonna take that.
I'll take every compliment I can get, sir.
No, but seriously, I was pretty excited to go listen to you and do your seminars. And so what the first thing that I wanted to talk about is you are an accomplished author. You do have a book that is out there on Drive-Thru RPG. It's called Encounter Theory, the Adventure Design Workbook. And it's a very interesting piece of work. I like it. You essentially basically looked at RPG games and said, what makes good encounters? What makes good games? And you've laid out your theory in your seminars. And essentially, Encounter Theory. I agree with a lot of things that you said. There are a number of times when, as a DM, I'm going through and I'm looking at games and they'll have like the random encounters. And it's kind of funny that you use the random encounter example of the vampire in the caves.
Yeah, that's a Tracy Hickman example from back in the day, actually. Yeah.
Yes. And I have, when I go back through my old, first edition AD&D, second edition, and I'm converting them to, games that I play nowadays, I'm still a stickler for 3.5. I'm one of those, like bah humbug 3.5. But we can talk about that later. But the encounter theory, random encounters. I never understood some of the random encounters in the tables. I sat there and I look at this, and especially as a DM, when you got the group and you got the party, you have the objectives, you got the underlying, plot lines and stories. And you want to get them from point A to point B, but you want to make it interesting. And then they throw in these, random encounters, and some of these just don't make sense. And they don't really perpetuate the game further forward. So Encounter Theory, Adventure Design Workbook. Explain to me how you decided to come along to design that and write it and what you wanted to make better.
So my podcast, Plot Points, we started out by saying we were the podcast that treats role-playing games like literature. And then after doing it for 6 years, we had a revelation, which was role-playing games are not literature. They are literary, but they are not literature. And that got me thinking a little bit deeper about role-playing games and what they were, because role-playing games are very new. We are still grappling with the newness of the role-playing game form. I think it was Robin Laws who said that if you were to trace the history of role-playing games and put it alongside the history of film, we are just past the introduction of sound in the history of role-playing games. So there's still a lot of territory and space out there to explore. And one of the things that occurred to me in reading adventure after adventure after adventure from my other podcast is that there's a lot of stuff in adventures that you don't need. And as a matter of fact, oftentimes putting less in makes them better. And, if you have and furthermore, another thing that drove me crazy was you would have genius game designers who couldn't write good adventures. Why is it that Mark Reinhagen and Lisa Stevens could create Vampire the Masquerade, but then the adventure in the second edition Vampire the Masquerade core book is no good at all? Why is it that we have so many D&D, AD&D, and third edition adventures out there, but how many of them are really excellent? And so the first thing I did was I looked at adventures that I thought were truly, truly excellent, like the first edition Ravenloft game by Tracy and Laura Hickman. I feel like that is a touchstone for me, and the Dracula dossier by Ken Hite and Gareth Ryder Hanrahan, because they're very different. One is a first edition kind of dungeon crawl. The other is a improvisational campaign using a fairly freeform system, the Gumshoe engine. And maybe they would disagree it's freeform, but that's a different thing.
Yes. Now, if I could stop you real quick.
Hey, I started feeling. Feel free to stop.
No, I ask Jason in the podcast. I interrupt him all the time. What really had me with your train of thought was when you talked about Ravenloft being such a great adventure, and essentially the thought of the contained sandbox that you discuss. And if people want to go listen to it for this Thanksgiving, you took off for Plot Points, and you and your two cohorts, the gentleman and the lady,
it's Brad and Sarah.
Brad and Sarah, you guys basically that was your first podcast.
Yeah, the first
breaking down the first edition Ravenloft.
Yep. first episode we ever did was doing a deep dive on the first edition Ravenloft adventure. And the reason that really stuck out in my mind as being amazing is it is this contained sandbox. Like once you it starts out in a tavern and you're told, hey, there's an evil count, go kill him. And you're like, okay, this is D&D. That's what I'm going to do. Off you go. You enter some gates. And once you enter the gates, you cannot leave until he is dead. But within those gates, you have total freedom. You can go anywhere and do anything. And the adventure is even replayable, which makes it even more engaging. And I could expound at length on how well written it is, but I won't. But it really made me realize that, like, if you're going to design good adventures, which is what Encounter Theory is all about, designing better adventures, one of the things that you should really do is make sure that players have total freedom. Your job as a game designer or adventure writer or DM is not to tell players what they're going to do. You don't write a story. You need to give them total freedom to deal with every problem they come across and treat them harshly. Like they come to the table expecting assassinations and murders and seductions. You don't need to figure out how they're going to solve a problem. You just need to put the problem in their way. Now, this, of course, and again, stop me if I'm spieling too much, but this presents problems of its own. Where, like, okay, if I'm going to give people total freedom and treat them harshly, how on earth am I going to write an adventure that's ever more than a page or two long? I understand you can start an adventure that way, but how do you continue one? And that was the next problem that I confronted in my Encounter Theory journey.
Yes, and I completely agree. And especially as a DM, it's nice to have that contained sandbox because it always happens. Every session that I run, I think we're going to get to this point, and sometimes we don't even get close. You know, because a lot of times the adventures and the characters in the party will throw you curveballs, and a lot of times they're a lot of fun, and sometimes you get to throw curveballs back. But ultimately, you want to keep them, focused on, the big picture. You have the encounter, which is inside the module, which is inside the campaign, and you're trying to move them along. And, especially sometimes when you're taking written works and then putting on your own homebrew spin, or you're tying, modules together for an overall theme, I have come across the questions like, well, how do I get them from here to there? Why do they do this? Why do they want to do that? Why do this? And so with your Encounter Theory, you break it down and you essentially have, worksheets, and it's not just for, fantasy RPG games. You can use it for any RPG games essentially. And so you've got it broken down between, you explain how to apply Encounter Theory. You have examples of opponent reaction breakouts, adventure structure organizer. And what I do like about it is, it basically takes it down and helps you organize your thoughts. And it has, broken down boxes of, what is the purpose of this encounter, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and one of the, it's all well and good to come up with a theory. But then I was like, well, how do thank you very much. Listeners at home, he was holding up a printed out copy of my book. But I was certainly like, well, okay, how is this theory going to be applied at the table? So I wanted to come up with some, I call them play plans, but because worksheets just sound so fourth grade.
It's so much like work.
Exactly. I came up with play plans to help you design better encounters for your homebrew games or for publication. I include in there an adventure showing you how I apply the theory and how I use the play plans to hopefully help people figure out what's going on. You kept saying move them along, and let me ask you a question. What do you mean by move them along?
Well, essentially, it's kind of like how you explained in Ravenloft. You give them the bait. Sometimes they take it. Sometimes they start going down that that trail, and then for example, they come across the the dead body with the real letter from the Burgermeister.
Yeah.
Same thing. The old. As you discussed. The old. You're sitting in a tavern. A guy walks in. Moving along the plots and et cetera. So sometimes when you're moving the people along. And what I like about your encounters, what is the purpose? What is going to link, A to B to C?
Okay, I got you now. Yeah, yes. And I mean, I would tell you, in my opinion, if the players are chasing something and having fun, that's kind of okay. And again, one of the problems with a lot of pre-published adventures is they're not written in such a way that if you want to do C instead of B, you can do that. Like I was reading the newest 5th edition D&D release, Baldur's Gate: Descent into Avernus. And I'm like, 15 pages in, and the geniuses at Wizards of the Coast, and I mean that sincerely, I'm not being sarcastic. There are geniuses who work at Wizards of the Coast.
I've got some opinions, let me tell you.
But they say, we assume that you go from here to there. I want to say we assume you go to the ship next, then a mansion. And like, that's it. And the thread moving you from your current location to the ship to the mansion, I think is perilously thin. And again, I understand at a D&D table as part of the social contract, you could probably just say, hey, the next encounter is here. Will you guys just go there? And a lot of players would just do it. But I would say that was a weak spot of design on the part of Wizards of the Coast. Like, you should be empowering players to let them do what they want and not saying, well, you have to go here because that's where the adventure is. Like, so far, I've read about a quarter of Descent to Avernus, and there's a lot of things I really like in it, but I really have a hard time with how railroady it is and how it just says you have to go from A to B to C to D. And what I do in Encounter Theory is I say, okay, I'm not going to tell you where you have to go, but I'm going to give you leads that take you from encounter to encounter to encounter, and you can follow them or you can not. Like a good encounter often will have more than one lead, and it doesn't matter where you go. I've planned for all of it. And again, I feel like you should be planning just enough to get you through. No long character backgrounds, no long histories, just enough to see what the characters are going to do. That's why I call it Encounter Theory, because everything that takes place at the role-playing game table is either an interaction between characters in the setting and characters and other characters, and those are encounters. And if you're a designer, it is in improving encounters that you will have the most impact. Did I answer your question?
Yes. And I do kind of like it, and it is kind of interesting. You talk about, a lot of the, RPG, stories are written, based on novels, and our listeners, if they want to go to listen to Plot Points, you talk about this in good detail. And, it essentially, you want the characters to make them think that they're doing what they want to do, but but in the back of your mind, they're doing exactly what you want them to do, to have a good time. And, essentially what you want to try and do is create, essentially, their own quote unquote, life adventure TV series, more or less, where they're the stars of the show and essentially almost make their own, basically creating their own novel as they go along. Does that make sense?
I would say so. And I think you're highlighting what makes role-playing games a radical and engaging new medium, which is it's group storytelling. I've compared it to myth. It used to be like, if you were going to tell a story that made sense of your life, if it was ancient Egypt, you had to be the pharaoh or a priest, and that was it. And today you can do that on a Sunday night around your table. You can tell stories of gods and monsters, and the TSR police aren't going to come and stop you.
No. Yes, you do have a lot of information in regards to TSR. So let's kind of use that as a segue.
Sure.
So, so you got the Encounter Theory in the books. It helps you write these adventures. But the other thing that I really enjoyed listening to your seminars and also listening to a number of your episodes on Plot Points is that you had me at 3rd edition, Creation of a Masterpiece. And I'm on our podcast. I am the D&D guy, along with Jeff and Jim. And I like to, talk about, recent things that are coming out and all that kind of fun stuff. And it is kind of interesting. I started playing when I was in 6th grade. No, 5th grade. Yeah, about, 5th, 6th grade.
The golden age.
Yes, the golden age, where you had the dice and you would take a crayon and you'd color in the numbers, on your plastic dice. Played at lunchtime. And I can't remember the first time I played, honestly. It's pretty bad. But a lot of times people say, well, I gotta remember this, et cetera, et cetera. Well, I don't remember that, but I remember I had a really good time. I played it up through my mid-20s. And then for, and then in the mid-90s, I can almost find nobody to play. And of course, I was living overseas too. I was stationed overseas.
So can I ask where you were?
Well, I was stationed in Spain for a couple years and rode to Spain. And then after that in La Maddalena, Italy.
Oh, wow. Italy, I hear, was great. Were Air Force, Army?
Yes, Navy.
Navy. Okay.
Yeah. So it was, so we would spend times on weekends playing role-playing games and etc. And I'd reached the point where, I think I'm done. Second edition, and I did the worst thing possible. I was coming back to the States. I was done. And I had this big box of Dungeons and Dragons, and I gave it to my buddy, and I said, "Here you go, pal." And I thought I was pretty much done, essentially role playing. Then let's fast forward 2 years. That was 98 when I came back into the States. But I can remember this. Year 2000. I'm in the mall when they still had Walden books and B. Daltons. Let me tell you, Sonny, we had bookstores. Yes. So, and I remember standing in there. It had been several years since I had done anything D&D or actually touched Dungeons and Dragons. And I'm standing there and I'm looking at the new releases up on the wall. And there is, the famous book, Dungeons and Dragons, with the little lock, tome on it. And I was looking at it and I was like, Dungeons and Dragons? What? That doesn't look like Dungeons and Dragons. So I picked it up. I started looking. It's like, oh, 3rd edition. And I started opening it up and I was looking at it. I'm like, you know what? This is actually pretty good. The art was spot on.
Oh, that art.
The print was great. They did away with thieves and they had this thing called Rogue.
Ooh.
And they had Barbarian. I went, oh, cartoon, Barbarian. And then the Ranger, and I started looking through it. I was like, you know what? I'm going to buy this book. Of course, this is the year 2000, right?
$20, well spent.
$20, well spent.
With the character generator on a CD-ROM.
I still have it. So a couple weeks go by. I started talking to my old fraternity brother from school. And I said, hey, you know what? I got a confession to make. Remember Dungeons and Dragons? They got a new edition out. And I actually bought the book. Nerd alert. And he starts laughing. He says, you know what? I just bought that book 2 weeks ago. Well, same thing. Walking in the store, looking at it. What is this? And then, as you know, my love affair with Dungeons and Dragons started all over again. Except this time it started as more of a mature. In air quotes.
You had money then to spend on it.
And I had money to spend on it. Yeah, exactly. So I love the fact that you are researching the sale of TSR and you're writing a book. You're on the George R.R. Martin plan of not meeting a deadline and having 4,000 words.
So a couple things. So I've been writing the book for just over 2 years.
Yes.
And it started out because my editor at Geek and Sundry was like, somebody needs to write an article about the fact that TSR used to exist and that Wizards of the Coast didn't always make Dungeons and Dragons. Being the Wisconsin guy, I was like, I'll do it. So off I went. And
Yes.
wrote. Go ahead. Sorry.
I'm sorry. And that is a good point, too. That's the other thing that intrigued me and it started me looking into things because I noticed, hey, this isn't TSR. This is Wizards of the Coast. Who the hell's Wizards of the Coast? But anyways, continue. I'm sorry.
That's okay. So I got some amazing material for that article.
Yes.
And not everything was able. And my one article became 3, but even then I couldn't fit all the amazing stuff in. And I'm like, well, we'll write a short book, 20, 30,000 words. Off I go. I'm here just over 2 years later. And so I've written, I'm going to say 160,000 words, but which to put that in comparison, the Da Vinci Code is 100,000 words long. Like a standard thriller is 100,000 words. So I've ended up separating my book into 2. Everything that takes place in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, and involves TSR is one book, and then everything that is Wizards of the Coast, 3rd edition, Seattle, is another book. And the TSR book, I'm going to guess I'm within a week or 2 of having it done. I would hope that by December, by the end of December, I would hope by the end of December, if we were having this conversation, I could tell you who's publishing it. So, I mean, things on that front are both nearing completion and becoming very exciting. But the thing that happened over the last 2 years is TSR folk and Wizards of the Coast folk both opened up and really spoke the truth, because this all happened 20 years ago, and people are just kind of like, whatever, I'm just going to say it. B, people just started sending me stuff.
Really?
This happened after Gen Con, so this will be new to you probably. Okay. After Gen Con, a source sent me 20 years of TSR sales data, everything from 1979 through 1999. Was the sales data I had. And we'd never seen this before. Like, no one ever actually knew how many copies of second edition Dungeons and Dragons were sold. And there was a fascinating tale hidden in that data, which was this. And there's a lot of stories, but this is the one that I think is the most interesting. If you take Advanced Dungeons and Dragons and add the sales of all of its core books to the sales of second edition Dungeons and Dragons, and then you add that to the second edition revised that came out in, I believe, 1995, and then you took that pile of sales and compared it to the sales of basic D&D in the early 1980s, basic D&D was a bigger pile than all of those other things. And it just never occurred. Like, I'd never even imagined it, that like back in the early 1980s, that basic Dungeons and Dragons, those red boxes and those basic editions, that was actually more popular than AD&D might have ever been. And I grew up playing AD&D. It sounds like you played a lot of second edition AD&D, but the sales numbers say like, maybe they should have stopped making Advanced Dungeons and Dragons and gone back and doubled down on Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah, you know what? That is pretty amazing. I did listen to your episode on plot points where you talked about all that, and it does make me sit there and think, because the basic Larry Elmore Red Dragon, I had that box, and I gave it away. I wish I had it still, but and I sat there and and it makes sense. It's very basic. I mean, you play a dwarf, you're a dwarf. Elf, human, you can be thief, wizard, whatever, etc. It's very simple. It's very straightforward. It's like, here you go. And then that's how I started out playing D&D. And then they came basic. And then they came out, oh my gosh, B4, The Lost City, loved it. So then they come out with this expert. Like, well, what is expert? Well, I guess it's a step above basic D&D. So we started playing an expert, and we go into there, and then all of a sudden I get this player's handbook, and I come across this Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. What is this? Well, this must be the sophisticated version of Dungeons and Dragons, because now you have races, you have classes, you have it gets a little bit more complex, and it has all this other things that the basic and the expert and the eventually the companion set didn't have. And so I could see a lot of people sticking with the basics and the experts, and because it's just a very simple, fun game to play. When I go to Gen Con, you may have played it too. There is always a couple keep on the Borderlands, and you just go in and you're basic, boom, you start. It's really easy, and you go in and you play for several hours, and then you don't finish the game.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that revelation made me start considering that perhaps, just perhaps, a simpler version of Dungeons and Dragons will be more successful. Like, if Wizards of the Coast has said that the last 2 years for Dungeons and Dragons have been the best years in the history ever, which means that currently Wizards of the Coast is outselling those early 1980s modules, if everything is true. And it's worth considering if the Dungeons and Dragons that can break out into popular culture is simply one that was simpler than the ones that like you and I really grew up in the heat, it sounds like, of second edition and third edition. And I certainly always would have described Dungeons and Dragons as a more complex simulationist game. But I didn't discover basic D&D until 11 months ago. And when I did, I was like, this is amazing. Like, it blew my mind. I was I can understand, like, this is so much fun. I would totally play this right now. And the Rules Cyclopedia from 1991, which collected all that knowledge, is such an amazing book. Like, it plays beautifully at the table. Like, the index is amazing. Everything is just so brief and easy to find. And I'm like, okay, I can totally understand why this took off. But I think it's worth considering, especially for people of our generation, that maybe, just maybe, D&D does need to be simpler if it's going to become a popular thing in mass culture.
I think so today. I would definitely agree. I think essentially the overall culture, the instantaneous gratification, A lot of things that people talk about, they love the D&D encounters. They love the, like the Pathfinder sessions where you just show up at the bookstore and you sit down for 2 hours, you're given a character, here's the encounters, and boom, you're done. And then maybe if you show up next week, it'll be, step 7 of the long path of just, things that they put together. And I think, we're so distracted by so many things these days. I think there's a satisfaction that a lot of people get when they can just say, you know what, I want to play. I can't get the group together. We can't meet on this time. We can't do this. They can go down to, the renaissance of the RPG stores, which are surviving on, bringing people in to play is essentially. Instead of just having the books and selling things to them, now they have these large sections of tables, and it's not just, RPG or Dungeons and Dragon nights, they'll mix it up with other games and board games where you don't need a set group to agree on a time. You can just go there, sit down, hammer some RPG and role playing out, and then go home and move on to the next one, or go pick up the kids for soccer. It is a good basic satisfaction, and that is probably part of why 5th edition is taking off. I think with the 3rd edition in 3.5, which I'm still old and hankering, I still play it, and we still have a group, and we still play it. I still like it because even though I enjoyed the basic D&D and the expert and all that kind of fun stuff, 2nd edition was great because it kind of expanded on, the advanced D&D. But I always had problems with things like polearm. Well, you can have a halberd, you can have a guisarme, you can have this other fancy French thing I can't pronounce, but they just do D12.
Yeah,
And the other thing was I did love about the secondary skills in the 2nd edition D&D. He's like, hey, you can be a Boyer Fletcher background. Hey, you can be a armor, armor smith background. It's like, okay, well, that's good because that would explain how you can fix stuff. And then, when you roll that 1 critical miss and house rules say your bowstring's broke, how are you going to fix it? Well, hey, I'm a Boyer Fletcher. That's great. And the one thing, and this is good because you do get to you have talked to for example, Monty Cook. We can talk a little bit later. He's an interesting cat, isn't he? And I do love the fact that Tweet, Cook, and Skip Williams, fueled by Peter Atkinson, of course,
and Rich Baker.
Yes,
he made the Barbarian and the Sorcerer, as I recall.
Yes, and those are great characters, by the way. So they took it and they actually gave it, hey, this does slashing damage. This does bludgeoning damage. And it's like and I'm like, I love it. Finally, there's a reason why you would have a halberd as opposed to a gnome hook hammer.
Yeah,
because you could do these special things, and they added feats. And you talk about in your seminars and also in your plot points, podcast yourself about how they mix things. Monty mixed things up, and you couldn't touch. Some things were sacred cows that they couldn't touch. Other things they can go into. And I love the skills because, and I love the feats. There's way too many spells, but that's okay. But and I think sometimes people get intimidated if they played 4th edition or 5th edition, and they come back to this and like, well, there's all these feats. I don't know what to do. It's like, no, just take it easy. Just go level by level. But and what I liked about it is the fact that when you played basic, expert, or AD&D, for example, basic, expert, you're an elf, was an elf. Fighter. AD&D, Thaco. Let's break out the calculators. And why do things go negative? I don't know. And they simplified it with the D20, which I love. And the open license was a genius idea. And so you can make 10 fighters in 3rd edition or 3.5, and all 10 fighters can be different. Every character you can make, you can basically customize and specialize. And I notice in the 5th edition now, because I don't play 5th edition, but I have to for Gen Con.
Yeah.
But I am familiar with it. I'll look at the rule books. My nephew's been turned on to it. I've helped him out get really super excited about it. And my sister thanks me. So yeah, now there's.
Well, how old is your nephew?
He is 16.
Yeah, I mean, all
He's in
of
a
the
D&D
research
club at school.
I mean, it improves reading, it improves writing, it improves test scores. It's crazy.
Vocabulary.
Oh yeah.
How many people know what a portcullis is? You've never gamed before.
Yeah.
So you can go ahead and you create, with the 5th edition, they're coming up now, these variants. I'm like, well, you know what? You could have just made that character in 3.5 if you wanted, or in the backgrounds. But, so when you're talking about creation of a masterpiece, I loved it. And of course, I always wondered, and I went back on my own a little bit to read about books. And, I got the old, 30 Years of Adventure, Celebrations of Dungeons and Dragons with the intro by Vin Diesel. And I sit there and I look at it. And I'm like, yeah, what did happen with TSR? Why did that fail? You had great artists like Clive and Elmore and their icons, iconic TSR. And, who is this Wizards of the Coast? Who's this Peter Atkinson guy? And what does Pokemon have to do with this? And looking into it, I did my own amateurish research. But the best part is, Ben, you summed it up.
Well, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
That story of what happened there is complicated, but I've heard it summarized aptly by 2 different people.
Okay.
John Ratliff, who was an editor at TSR and went on to write the definitive version, I shouldn't say definitive, the definitive critical work on J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit. He said, you can only make so many mistakes before it ends up killing you. Mm-hmm. And Jim Falone, who was a director of sales at TSR, he said that TSR felt a need to innovate, so it engaged in a number of endeavors which ultimately failed, like TSR West, which was their attempt to build a comic book company. That gave the company debt. The company then added to its problems by making a large number of products that literally lost the company money. For example, every Dark Sun adventure that they ever sold, which came with a flip book inside it, lost the company $1 per game. The Encyclopedia Magica, which you might remember from the mid 90s, and was amazing and beautiful and fantastic, barely made any money at all. It sold really well, but the book itself was so expensive it wasn't profitable for the company to make. So the company started borrowing money from Random House through a very complicated method that I won't bore you about right now. But they borrowed money from Random House. They didn't pay it back. And then on top of that, every January, they would try and get every hobby store in America to pre-buy all its TSR material.
The business plan. This is an amazing business plan. Yes, please continue, because it just blew me away when you told me about it.
I know, when I heard this,
not
I
me.
couldn't believe it. Yeah, but so they would get everybody to commit to making purchases that year. And they would give the hobby stores a discount for doing so. TSR would then take these contracts they have with hobby stores and sell them to banks. And the banks would say, okay, but again, we're going to take a lower percentage here. So TSR, on the one hand, it gets all the money it's going to get from the hobby trade in January. So it is this pile of money it can use to budget for the year. The downside is, A, they're making 18 cents less on every dollar they sell in the hobby trade, which is a lot. B, it gives them no room at all to be fleet on their feet or responding to the industry. When Magic the Gathering came out and Vice President of Creative Services Jim Ward decided that TSR had to make a response, which is a game called Spellfire, he was told, you can do it, but you can spend no money. Like, you will have a budget of nothing to do this, which is why, if you are familiar with Spellfire, it had recycled art from prior TSR products. Now, Jim Ward went out and he said, we have such beautiful art. Why not use it again? Which sounds reasonable until, the customers were not necessarily persuaded by that. But then when you hear, oh, you had no budget, then you're like, that makes sense. And of course, Jim Ward couldn't go out and say, well, we have no budget, so that's why we're doing it. But all of this you have products that aren't making money. You have debt accumulating. You're making 18% less on every dollar you sell. Eventually, all that just comes due when their debt with Random House gets so big. Random House sues them, returns a bunch of product. TSR fires a bunch of people. For about 3 months, they're not allowed to make any product at all because they also weren't paying their printer. And they let their printer become their landlord, and they signed an exclusivity agreement with their printer, allowing that, so they couldn't go anywhere else to print their books. And then Wizards of the Coast comes in and buys them.
Exactly. They became so constricted by their own enormity and business plans that they couldn't react to disruptors in the market.
I was like, when I started, I was like, there must be an easy one-sentence version of what happened. 2 years later, I'm like, there's not a one-sentence version, but I can probably do it in less than 3 minutes if I'm really hurried. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if that was 3 minutes or not, but I think I summarized it okay.
I'll take it. It is probably better than my beer influenced rendition several months ago when I talked about Gen Con and your seminar. But it's probably more coherent, too, by the way.
The beer might be more fun, though.
Yes. Yeah, but it is amazing. They lock themselves into this, what it seems to be a great plan. They should be making lots of money because you're in the market. And as your big question goes, where did the money go? Where is the money?
So my answer to that would be a couple things. It would be if you consider that TSR claimed to gross $40 million in 1996, the last complete year before they failed, they probably only brought in 33% of that because a cut goes to their distributor, a cut goes to the retailers. So if they're bringing in $10 to $15 million, they probably have more than that in debt, because I know for a fact that they had about $9.5 million they owed Random House in late 1996. And I would imagine they probably had between $1 and $5 million in other outstanding debt from things like starting a comic book company. So when you look at that and you realize that like your debt equals 100% of your net, that's a hard place to be in. And it looks like they started looking for buyers in late 1996, early 1997. And it's just a lot of bad decisions accumulating over time. It puzzled me initially, though. They put out these bragging press releases where they're like, we had the best year ever. We made over $40 million. Suck it, Wizards of the Coast. And then 18 months later, they're bought by Wizards of the Coast. Like, they called out Peter Adkison, CEO of Wizards, being like, we noticed you closed your role-playing game division. Sucks to be you.
Yes.
So
it is. Yeah, and it's also interesting to listen to Peter talk about eventually how he made that purchase happen through his attorney and et cetera. And I'm actually pretty thankful that he did, because eventually, everything that Guy Gex and Arneson and everybody through all the years at TSR, and you've got to meet a lot of these people, and you're interviewing them for your podcast, and you're writing this book with them. And I wish I was up there in Wisconsin to do this, but I could do without the snow. But I do know that you do have a heart out this evening, and I've got so much more I would like to ask in questions. But I like to play a game sometimes when we have guests on our podcast. You do quick answer questions, right?
All right, let's do it.
All right, here we go. Dragonlance, will they ever get the Game of Thrones TV or movie deal?
No.
Oh man. All right, what edition Dungeons & Dragons, if you had to pick one to continue to play for the rest of your life and none others, which would it be?
Basic.
Basic. Would you be a DM or a player?
I'd like to be a player, but I'd probably be a DM.
Yeah, see, side note on tangents, I used to be player all the time, and then I got stuck with DMing, and I've loved it ever since.
But there's three kinds of people who are DMs: people who have a story to tell, people who are rules lawyers, and people who do it because no one else will. And the third type are always the best.
I fit all three. I'm perfect. Okay, and then one class to play.
Fighter.
Basic. Fighter. Okay. Another one. Have you ever made a pitch to Enzo Ferrari?
No.
No. All right. Eye of the Beholder. Did you get a chance to see that documentary?
I have not seen it yet, ironically, considering that I've read the art book on D&D. I haven't seen the documentary yet. I should get around to it.
You should. It's very good. I got every year when I go to Gen Con, I talk to Larry Elmore and I make an ass of myself. And I did it again this year because I bought it, and then the guy distracted me. I said, "Can Larry sign it?" And he's, "Oh yeah." And he distracted me. "Hey, he paints everything. It's not digital." I'm like, duh, that's why I'm here. And when I think Dungeons and Dragons in my mind, it's Larry and Clive's art and the Four Horsemen. It's all their art that comes to my mind. And you basically caught it very well with Monty Cook, because you love the art that Monty Cook does. I love the art that Monty Cook gets. And I'll tell you what, I couldn't do Pathfinder because I couldn't picture people's hands bigger than their head. Granted, the artist is talented. I love the guy. He does do some good stuff. But I just have art is so important to a product. And if it doesn't have the right art, it can go sideways for you.
Yep.
As you talked with Spellfire, in the cards. But okay, so Ben, thank you very much for giving me some of your busy time. I wish you very good luck on your book. When it comes out, give me a chance to pick up the conversation again.
Yeah,
Remember us little people.
Hey, if you want to talk again like February or something, that'd be great. I'm going to Barcelona in February, so I'd love to hear some tips.
Barcelona. Alca, yes. Las Ramblas, I'll help you out. Barcelona was my favorite city until I went to Prague.
Oh, wow. That's amazing. Well, you have a good night. Thank you so much, Blake. It was great to be here.
Thank you, Ben.
Oh, and I guess I should say Encounter Theory is my book. Find it on DriveThruRPG. Plot Points Podcast is my podcast. Go check that out, too. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ben.
Bye-bye.
Okay, we ready? Sound good in there? All right, cool. All right, Alan Sherman, 12 Days of Christmas parody for History of Bad Ideas, take 1. On the first day of Christmas, Hobie gave to me a Japanese transistor radio. On this, what? Really? All right. Okay, all right, I can do it, okay. Alan Sherman, 12 Days of Christmas parody for History of Bad Ideas, take 2. On the first day of Christmas, Hobie gave to me a History of Bad Ideas IOU. On the second day of Christmas, Hobie gave to me green polka dot pajamas and a History of Bad Ideas. What? Really? Well, that too? Oh, okay. All right. All right, okay, we'll take it from the top again. All right, Alan Sherman, 12 Days of Christmas parody for History of Bad Ideas, take 3. On the first day of Christmas, Hobie gave to me a History of Bad Ideas IOU. On the second day of Christmas, Hobie gave to me 2 IOUs and a History of Bad Ideas IOU. It's a Nakashima. On the third day of Christmas, Hobie gave to me a calendar book with the name of my insurance man, 2 IOUs and a hit. Now what? Are you serious? They didn't get the calendar book. Okay, all right, fine. All right, can you just dub this in? Just dub this in. I don't want to start from the beginning again, okay? All right, cool. Let's see, where am I? Okay, yeah. 3 IOUs, 2 IOUs, and a History of Bad Ideas IOU. It's better than money. On the 4th day of Christmas, Hobie gave to me. Are you... Really? Nothing? Not the whole thing? I mean, what the fuck? What the fuck am I doing this song for then? All right, fine. You know what? I'm done. Let's just get this over with, okay? 12 IOUs, 11 IOUs, 10 IOUs, 9 IOUs, 8 IOUs, 7 IOUs, 6 IOUs, 5 IOUs, 4 IOUs, 3 IOUs, 2 IOUs, and a History of Bad Ideas IOU.